Hi, my name's Steve Champion, and today I want to talk to you about a process we've developed to avoid serious employment disputes, and we half-jokingly refer to that process as the Champion method. I say half-jokingly because I'm not so vain as to think I'm so gifted that I can create brilliant theories from scratch. However, I can say that life experience has gifted me the Champion method, which when applied correctly has time and again resulted in excellent outcomes from both an employer and employee perspective. Let me also emphasise that the Champion method is not a trick in the sense that it disrespects anyone or that it's purely a cynical way to manipulate a situation to achieve an employer win over an unsuspecting employee. In fact, I think it's a fantastic outcome in not only does it tick all the legislative boxes, but it also is a decent thing to do in dealing with real people and what will in many situations be a highly sensitive and potentially legally explosive discussion. Enough of that preamble. What is this Champion method all about? It originally came from situations where we were contacted by a client employer wanting to make a particular employee redundant and wanting to know how to handle the situation, or rather how to handle that delicate discussion with the employee to get a good outcome. Now, technically, under the Fair Work Act, an employee cannot take an unfair dismissal case against their employer where, one, the redundancy is genuine, two, the employer has followed the consultation provisions of any award or applicable enterprise agreement about the redundancy, and three, if it would not have been reasonable for the employee to be redeployed into another role within the employer's business or an associated entity. Well, that's certainly a mouthful to absorb, so let me break it all down a little bit. Firstly, the redundancy has to be genuine in that the employer no longer requires the employee's job to be performed by anyone due to changes in the employer's business. So you can't just decide the easiest way to get rid of an unwelcome employee is just to make them redundant. If you did, then the employee could challenge the whole redundancy by making out a case that there was really another reason behind the employee's termination, such as taking a dislike to the employee's performance for some reason, which wasn't shared properly with the employee, or if it was handled in an unfair way or wasn't a valid reason for dismissal. All of which means the employee could win up to 6 months damages, or even worse, be reinstated to their previous position, quite possibly with all their wages forgone since the termination. If the employer had employed another person to fill the role previously performed by the terminated employee, the employer might also then be faced with having to terminate the new employee as well. Not a good outcome. We'll return to the concept of redundancy later and where it might be an appropriate solution. The second requirement is the need to consult with the employee about the proposed redundancy. This generally means providing information to the employee or employees, including in writing, about the effect of the proposed changes in the workplace, which will obviously need to include the termination of the employee's employment, plus the redundancy entitlement to be paid to the employee, amongst other things. This consultation needs to take place as soon as a definite decision has been made to make the changes. The third requirement to avoid an employee being able to take an unfair dismissal action is it would not have been reasonable to redeploy the employee elsewhere in the business, including in related entities. There was a case some years back where employees of a construction company in Victoria were to be made redundant at the same time that the employer was hiring employees in Queensland. The employer assumed, well, the employees wouldn't want to move to Queensland, so it didn't offer the roles to the employees. Each employee made redundant was then paid the maximum 6 months damages for an unfair dismissal, a very expensive outcome for the employer. That particular case emphasises that the role need not be the same or even a similar role to the one the employee previously held, just that the employee is made aware of any available roles so she or he might reasonably consider them and make their own decision. After hearing all this, you might now be thinking, well, this is all so complex, this Champion method is not something you can usefully apply to real life. Well, let me piece it all together for you now. Firstly, you should not attempt to dress up a termination as a redundancy if it isn't really a true redundancy situation forced on you by operational changes. From the outset, the employee may suspect that they're being done over by you as their employer by calling it a redundancy. At least some employees, and perhaps nowadays many of them, will think to themselves they aren't going to allow their employer to do this to them, and they're going to fight you on this. There are hosts of no-win, no-fee lawyers out there willing to take these sorts of cases on for disgruntled employees. Let's return to the question of genuine redundancies a bit later. Secondly, once you make a definite decision to implement a redundancy, you have to consult with your employees affected by the decision. Here I'm going to urge you to take a different approach that seems to have had a positive impact in the many situations where we have suggested the champion method be used. The approach is to say to the employee or employees affected that you have yet to make a final decision on the situation of change that you are considering, but rather want to share your thoughts with the employee or employees and get their input before you make a final decision. The difference in this approach is that you're including the employee in the process before you have decided the outcome, which actually empowers them to some extent have some control over their outcome and their future. The alternative, where you tell the employee what you've already decided, is to leave the employee with only one alternative course of action: fight it or accept it. Some may decide to accept it, but how are you going to be clear who those people will be before you make the decision? By saying that no firm decision is yet to be taken, but you are sharing your current thinking with them, you have still complied with the required consultation requirements, and here I'm assuming you will also provide the other required information in writing and meet the other formal obligations of the award or enterprise agreement. We can give you advice on that. But you're also giving the employee the opportunity to tell you what they think before you have pulled the trigger, so to speak. For example, if they reply that they will not accept the decision and they'll see you in court, you can say that you want to make clear that no decision has been made yet. You're just discussing your thinking about with the employee before you take a particular course of action. It would be extremely unlikely that an employee could successfully claim constructive dismissal in such a situation when you're just sharing ideas before an actual decision is made. Alternatively, the employee might say that they know other employees are willing to be made redundant voluntarily because they talked about it, and you should consider talking to them as well. In one real-life situation where we shared this approach with a client, the employee, who was in a reasonably senior role, the employee burst into tears and said, look, they knew they weren't performing well in their role and they'd actually been looking for a way out. The employee was actually highly thankful that they were to be made redundant, and they could seek work elsewhere without the fear that it would become known they'd been terminated by the previous employer for poor performance. Other employees have thought about it over the weekend and returned to work to tell their employer that they've accepted the change, as long as they get paid their redundancy entitlements, which presumably had provided to them in writing as part of the consultation process in any event, so they had the figures in front of them. Part of the consultation process should also include any other roles that might possibly be available within the organisation. It might be a lower salary range, it might be part-time instead of full-time, or even casual, or at a different location from where they currently work. But never assume the employee won't accept the alternative role. Give them the opportunity to reject the alternatives to meet the third requirement to avoid an unfair dismissal that I explained earlier. Will this champion method always work? I guess the point about the method is that it provides an opportunity to gauge how the employee will likely react before advising them of the final decision. By involving the employee in the decision-making process, you're providing with greater control over the ultimate outcome, which also allows you to benefit from other extraneous factors you didn't even know about, such as the employee was considering leaving in any event. Now, some employees will react whatever you do, but by sharing your thoughts rather than the final decision, you get the opportunity to adapt your approach. Where the employee becomes highly upset or even threatening, you should probably advise them, look, you're going to take a break in the discussion for the time being to allow the employee to calm down a little bit and also to consider what you were really trying to communicate to them. Sometimes just breaking the discussion for a day or a few days can arrive at a completely different outcome because the employee can start to consider other alternatives other than a legal battle. Alternatively, you will know that the employee is going to fight you to the end, in which case you could consider your other options, including extending the consultation process, perhaps getting more advice, maybe not even deciding not even to terminate the employee if it's got the option there. Rushing a bad situation, it's rarely going to have a good impact on the outcome. Another benefit of the fundamental principles that comprise the so-called champion method is that it can also be applied to other non-redundancy situations. For example, where you share your thoughts with the employee, you're not completely satisfied with their performance for some reason, but before commencing a performance improvement process with them, you wanted to discuss the situation before implementing the performance improvement plan. Some employees are going to agree with you because they know they aren't performing. They might already have been seeking an alternative role in the job market. If they're wanting to explore what you're willing to offer financially to allow them to walk away with their head held high, you could possibly consider suggesting that by written agreement with them only, and not something you would ever want to force on them, that you could pay them the applicable redundancy scale for the length of service as a way of having a financial outcome. This offer would need to be recorded in a formal deed of release to prevent the employee changing their mind later on. The benefit of the redundancy scale is that it's a firm formula. It's not one that you're going to have to negotiate. If it becomes apparent the redundancy scale isn't going to be sufficient to satisfy the employee or the employee's expectations, then you probably need to confirm with them, look, okay, then we'll need to start implementing the performance improvement plan instead, which is just what is fit and proper. Some employees are going to think about that over the weekend and come back and go, look, where can I sign that redundancy agreement that you were talking about? Some people are going to watch this video and say it's just an ingenuous way of cheating an employee out of their real entitlements. But I beg to differ on that. I disagree with the idea that it is a trick because it's based on treating someone like a real human being, not just a number. It involves them in designing their future before firm decisions are taken and how, or even whether, they will leave the organisation. I've given client employers a script for the champion method many times in the past, and I've yet to hear a negative outcome. In all situations, it helps achieve a better outcome for all parties than might otherwise have occurred. At ER Strategies, we consciously don't try to give textbook answers to every situation. We try to achieve the best outcome for our clients, and this can often involve looking after your employees where that's warranted as well. Call us on 1300 55 6637 if you'd like to find out more about one of our advisory packages. Thanks for listening and have a great day.